In naval terminology, a destroyer is a fast, maneuverable long-endurance warship intended to escort larger vessels in a fleet, convoy, or battle group and defend them against smaller powerful short-range attackers. They were originally developed in the late 19th century as a defense against torpedo boats, and by the time of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, these torpedo boat destroyers, TBDs, were a large, swift, and powerfully armed torpedo boats designed to destroy other torpedo boats. Although the term destroyer had been used interchangeably with TBD and torpedo boat destroyer by navies since 1892, the term torpedo boat destroyer had been generally shortened to simply destroyer by nearly all navies by the First World War. Before World War II, destroyers were light vessels with little endurance for unattended ocean operations, typically a number of destroyers and a single destroyer tender operated together. After the war, the advent of the guided missile allowed destroyers to take on the surface combatant roles previously filled by battleships and cruisers. This resulted in larger and more powerful guided missile destroyers more capable of independent operation. At the start of the 21st century, destroyers are the global standard for surface combatant ships, with only two nations, United States and Russia, operating the heavier class cruisers, with no battleships or true battlecruisers remaining. Modern guided missile destroyers are equivalent in tonnage but vastly superior in firepower to cruisers of the World War II era, and are capable of carrying nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. At 510 feet, 160 m, long, a displacement of 9,200 tons, and with armament of more than 90 missiles, guided missile destroyers such as the Arleigh Burke class are actually larger and more heavily armed than most previous ships classified as guided missile cruisers. Some European navies, such as the French, Spanish, or German, use the term frigate for their destroyers, which leads to some confusion. Origins. The emergence and development of the destroyer was related to the invention of the self-propelled torpedo in the 1860s. A navy now had the potential to destroy a superior enemy battle fleet using steam launches to fire torpedoes. Cheap, fast boats armed with torpedoes called torpedo boats were built and became a threat to large capital ships near enemy coasts. The first seagoing vessel designed to launch the self-propelled Whitehead torpedo was the 33-ton Hms Lightning in 1876. She was armed with two drop collars to launch these weapons. These were replaced in 1879 by a single torpedo tube in the bow. By the 1880s, the type had evolved into small ships of 50-100 tons, fast enough to evade enemy picket boats. At first, the threat of a torpedo boat attack to a battle fleet was considered to exist only when at anchor, but as faster and longer-range torpedoes were developed, the threat extended to cruising at sea. In response to this new threat, more heavily gunned picket boats called catchers were built which were used to escort the battle fleet at sea. They needed significant seaworthiness and endurance to operate with the battle fleet, and as they necessarily became larger, they became officially designated torpedo boat destroyers, and by the First World War were largely known as destroyers in English. The anti-torpedo boat origin of this type of ship is retained in its name in other languages, including French, contratorpilleur, Italian, cacciatorpedinier, Portuguese, contratorpediero, Czech, torpedoborek, Greek, antitorpeliko alpha nu tau iota tau omicron rho pi iota lambda iota kappa, Dutch, torpedobootjager, and, up until the Second World War, Polish, kontrtorpedoik, now obsolete. Once destroyers became more than just catchers guarding an anchorage, it was realized that they were also ideal to take over the role of torpedo boats themselves, so they were fitted with torpedo tubes as well as guns. At that time, and even into World War I, the only function of destroyers was to protect their own battle fleet from enemy torpedo attacks and to make such attacks on the battleships of the enemy. The task of escorting merchant convoys was still in the future. Early designs. An important development came with the construction of HMS Swift in 1884, later redesignated TB-81. This was a large, 137-ton, torpedo boat with 4 47mm quick-firing guns and 3 torpedo tubes. At 23.75 knots, 43.99 km per hour, 27.33 miles per hour, while still not fast enough to engage enemy torpedo boats reliably, the ship at least had the armament to deal with them. Another forerunner of the torpedo boat destroyer was the Japanese torpedo boat Kotake, Falcon, built in 1885. Designed to Japanese specifications and ordered from the London Yarrow shipyards in 1885, she was transported in parts to Japan, where she was assembled and launched in 1887. The 165-foot, 50 m, long vessel was armed with 4 1-pounder, 37 mm, quick-firing guns and 6 torpedo tubes, reached 19 knots, 35 km per hour, and at 203 tons, was the largest torpedo boat built to date. In her trials in 1889, Kotake demonstrated that she could exceed the role of coastal defense, and was capable of accompanying larger warships on the high seas. The Yarrow shipyards, builder of the parts for Kotake, considered Japan to have effectively invented the destroyer. Torpedo Gunboat. The first vessel designed for the explicit purpose of hunting and destroying torpedo boats was the torpedo gunboat. Essentially very small cruisers, torpedo gunboats were equipped with torpedo tubes and an adequate gun armament, intended for hunting down smaller enemy boats. By the end of the 1890s, torpedo gunboats were made obsolete by their more successful contemporaries, the torpedo boat destroyers, which were much faster. The first example of this was Hms Rattlesnake, designed by Nathaniel Barnaby in 1885, and commissioned in response to the Russian war scare. The gunboat was armed with torpedoes and designed for hunting and destroying smaller torpedo boats. Exactly 200 feet, 61 m, long and 23 feet, 7.0 m, in beam, she displaced 550 tons. Built of steel, Rattlesnake was unarmored with the exception of a 3/4-inch protective deck. She was armed with a single 4-inch/25-pounder breech-loading gun, 6 3-pounder QF guns and 4 14-inch, 360 mm, torpedo tubes, arranged with 2 fixed tubes at the bow and a set of torpedo dropping carriages on either side. 4 torpedo reloads were carried. A number of torpedo gunboat classes followed, including the Grasshopper class, the Sharpshooter class, the Alarm class and the Dryad class, all built for the Royal Navy during the 1880s and the 1890s. Fernando Villamil, second officer of the Ministry of the Navy of Spain, designed his own torpedo gunboat to combat the threat from the torpedo boat. He asked several British shipyards to submit proposals capable of fulfilling these specifications. In 1885, the Spanish Navy chose the design submitted by the shipyard of James and George Thompson of Clydebank. Destructor, destroyer in Spanish, was laid down at the end of the year, launched in 1886, and commissioned in 1887. She displaced 348 tons, and was equipped with triple expansion engines generating 3,784 IP. 2,822 kilowatts, for a maximum speed of 22.6 knots, 41.9 kilometers per hour, which made her one of the faster ships in the world in 1888. She was armed with 190 mm, 3.5 in, Spanish-designed Hontoria breech-loading gun, 457 mm, 2.2 in, 6-pounder, Nordenfeldt guns, 237 mm, 1.5 in, 3 PDR, Hotchkiss cannons and 2 15-inch, 38 cm, Schwarzkopf torpedo tubes. The ship carried 3 torpedoes per tube. She was manned by a crew of 60. In terms of gunnery, speed, and dimensions, the specialized design to chase torpedo boats and her high seas capabilities, Destructor was an important precursor to the torpedo boat destroyer. Development of the modern destroyer. The first ships to bear the formal designation Torpedo Boat Destroyer, TBD, were the Daring class of 2 ships and Havoc class of 2 ships of the Royal Navy. Early torpedo gunboat designs lacked the range and speed to keep up with the fleet they were supposed to protect. In 1892, the third Sea Lord, Rear Admiral John Jackie Fisher ordered the development of a new type of ships equipped with the then novel water tube boilers and quick-firing small-caliber guns. 6 ships to the specifications circulated by the Admiralty were ordered initially, comprising 3 different designs each produced by a different shipbuilder, HMS Daring and HMS Decoy from John I Thornycroft and Company, HMS Havoc and HMS Hornet from Yarrows, and HMS Ferret and HMS Lynx from Laird, Son and Company. These torpedo boat destroyers all featured a turtleback, i.e. rounded, forecastle that was characteristic of early British TBDs. HMS Daring and HMS Decoy were both built by Thornycroft, displaced 260 tons, 287.8 tons full load, and were 185 feet in length. They were armed with one 12-pounder gun and 3 6-pounder guns, with one fixed 18-in torpedo tube in the bow plus 2 more torpedo tubes on a revolving mount abaft the 2 funnels. Later the bow torpedo tube was removed and 2 more 6-pounder guns added instead. They produced 4,200 HP from a pair of Thornycroft water tube boilers, giving them a top speed of 27 knots, giving the range and speed to travel effectively with a battle fleet. In common with subsequent early Thornycroft boats, they had sloping sterns and double rudders. The French Navy, an extensive user of torpedo boats, built its first torpedo boat destroyer in 1899, with the Durandal-class Torpedo Gunboat. The United States commissioned its first torpedo boat destroyer, USS Bainbridge, Destroyer No. 1, in 1902, and by 1906 there were 16 destroyers in service with the U.S. Navy. Subsequent improvements. Torpedo boat destroyer designs continued to evolve around the turn of the 20th century in several key ways. The first was the introduction of the steam turbine. The spectacular unauthorized demonstration of the turbine-powered turbinia at the 1897 Spithead Navy Review, which, significantly, was of torpedo boat size, prompted the Royal Navy to order a prototype turbine-powered destroyer, HMS Viper of 1899. This was the first turbine warship of any kind and achieved a remarkable 36 knots, 67 km per hour, on sea trials. By 1910 the turbine had been widely adopted by all navies for their faster ships. The second development was the replacement of the torpedo boat-style turtleback foredeck by a raised forecastle for the new River-class destroyers built in 1903, which provided better seakeeping as well as more space below deck. The first warship to use only fuel oil propulsion was the Royal Navy's torpedo boat destroyer HMS Spiteful, after experiments in 1904. Although the obsolescence of coal as a fuel in British warships was delayed by its availability. Other navies also adopted oil, for instance the USN with the Paulding class of 1909. In spite of all this variety, destroyers adopted a largely similar pattern. The hull was long and narrow, with a relatively shallow draft. The bow was either raised in a forecastle or covered under a turtleback. Underneath this were the crew spaces, extending 1/4 to 1/3 the way along the hull. Aft of the crew spaces was as much engine space as the technology of the time would allow, several boilers and engines or turbines. Above deck, one or more quick-firing guns were mounted in the bows, in front of the bridge, several more were mounted amidships and astern. 2 tube mountings, later on, multiple mountings, were generally found amidships. Between 1892 and 1914 destroyers became markedly larger, initially 420 tons with a length of 250 feet, 76 m, for the U.S. Navy's first Bainbridge class of torpedo boat destroyers, up to the First World War with 300-foot, 91 m, long destroyers displacing 1,000 tons was not unusual. However, construction remained focused on putting the biggest possible engines into a small hull, resulting in a somewhat flimsy construction. Often hulls were built of steel only 1/8 in thick. By 1910 the steam-driven displacement, that is, not hydroplaning, torpedo boat had become redundant as a separate type. Germany nevertheless continued to build such boats until the end of World War I, although these were effectively small coastal destroyers. In fact, Germany never distinguished between the two types, giving them pennant numbers in the same series and never giving names to destroyers. Ultimately, the term torpedo boat came to be attached to a quite different vessel, the very fast hydroplaning motor-driven MTB. Early use in World War I. Navies originally built torpedo boat destroyers to protect against torpedo boats, but admirals soon appreciated the flexibility of the fast, multi-purpose vessels that resulted. Vice Admiral Sir Baldwin Walker laid down destroyer duties for the Royal Navy, screening the advance of a fleet when hostile torpedo craft are about, searching a hostile coast along which a fleet might pass, watching an enemy's port for the purpose of harassing his torpedo craft and preventing their return, attacking an enemy fleet. Early destroyers were extremely cramped places to live, being without a doubt magnificent fighting vessels, but unable to stand bad weather. During the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, the commander of the torpedo boat destroyer IJN Akatsuki described being in command of a destroyer for a long period, especially in wartime, is not very good for the health. Stating that he had originally been strong and healthy, he continued, life on a destroyer in winter, with bad food, no comforts, would sap the powers of the strongest men in the long run. A destroyer is always more uncomfortable than the others, and rain, snow, and sea water combine to make them damp. In fact, in bad weather there is not a dry spot where one can rest for a moment. The Japanese destroyer commander finished with, "Yesterday I looked at myself in a mirror for a long time. I was disagreeably surprised to see my face thin, full of wrinkles, and as old as though I were 50. My clothes, uniform, cover nothing but a skeleton, and my bones are full of rheumatism." In 1898 by the U.S. Navy officially classified Uss Porter, a 175-foot, 53 m, long all-steel vessel displacing 165 tons, as a torpedo boat. But her commander, Lt. John C. Fremont, described her as a compact mass of machinery not meant to keep the sea nor to live in, as 5/7 of the ship are taken up by machinery and fuel, whilst the remaining 2/7, fore and aft, are the crew's quarters, officers forward and the men placed aft. And even in those spaces are placed anchor engines, steering engines, steam pipes, etc., rendering them unbearably hot in tropical regions. Early combat. The torpedo boat destroyer's first major use in combat came during the Japanese surprise attack on the Russian fleet anchored in Port Arthur at the opening of the Russo-Japanese War on February 8, 1904. 3 destroyer divisions attacked the Russian fleet in port, firing a total of 18 torpedoes. However, only 2 Russian battleships, the Tsesarevuk and Ritvizan, as well as the protected cruiser Paleta, were seriously damaged due to the proper deployment of torpedo nets. Tsesarevuk, the Russian flagship, had her nets deployed, with at least 4 enemy torpedoes hung up in them, and other warships were similarly saved from further damage by their nets. While capital ship engagements were scarce in World War I, destroyer units engaged almost continually in raiding and patrol actions. The first shot of the war at sea was fired on August 5, 1914 by a destroyer of the 2nd Flotilla, HMS Lance, in an engagement with the German auxiliary mine layer SS Königin Louise. Destroyers were involved in the skirmishes that prompted the Battle of Heligoland Bight, and filled a range of roles in the Battle of Gallipoli, acting as troop transports and as fire support vessels, as well as their fleet screening role. Over 80 British destroyers and 60 German torpedo boats took part in the Battle of Jutland, which involved pitched small boat actions between the main fleets, and several foolhardy attacks by unsupported destroyers on capital ships. Jutland also concluded with a messy night action between the German High Seas Fleet and part of the British destroyer screen. The threat evolved by World War I with the development of the submarine, or U-boat. The submarine had the potential to hide from gunfire and close underwater to fire torpedoes. Early war destroyers had the speed and armament to intercept submarines before they submerged, either by gunfire or by ramming. Destroyers also had a shallow enough draft that torpedoes would find it difficult to hit them. The desire to attack submarines underwater led to rapid destroyer evolution during the war. They were quickly equipped with strengthened bows for ramming, and depth charges and hydrophones for identifying submarine targets. The first submarine casualty to a destroyer was the German U-19, rammed by HMS Badger on October 29, 1914. While U-19 was only damaged, the next month HMS Gary successfully sank U-18. The first depth charge sinking was on December 4, 1916, when UC-19 was sunk by HMS Llewellyn. The submarine threat meant that many destroyers spent their time on anti-submarine patrol. Once Germany adopted unrestricted submarine warfare in January 1917, destroyers were called on to escort merchant convoys. U.S. Navy destroyers were among the first American units to be dispatched upon the American entry to the war, and a squadron of Japanese destroyers even joined Allied patrols in the Mediterranean. Patrol duty was far from safe. Of the 67 British destroyers lost in the war, collisions accounted for 18, while 12 were wrecked. At the end of the war, the state-of-the-art was represented by the British W-class. 1918–1945. The trend during World War I had been towards larger destroyers with heavier armaments. A number of opportunities to fire at capital ships had been missed during the war, because destroyers had expended all their torpedoes in an initial salvo. The British V and W classes of the late war had sought to address this by mounting 6 torpedo tubes and 2 triple mounts, instead of the 4 or 2 on earlier models. The V and WS set the standard of destroyer building well into the 1920s. The 2 Romanian destroyers Murti and Mreti, on the other hand, had the greatest firepower of all destroyers in the world throughout the first half of the 1920s. This was largely due to the fact that, between their commissioning in 1920 and 1926, they retained the armament that they had while serving in the Italian Navy as scout cruisers, esploratori. When initially ordered by Romania in 1913, the Romanian specifications envisioned 3 120 mm guns, a caliber which would eventually be adopted as the standard for future Italian destroyers. Armed with 3 152 mm and 4 76 mm guns after being completed as scout cruisers, the 2 warships were officially re-rated as destroyers by the Romanian Navy. The 2 Romanian warships were thus the destroyers with the greatest firepower in the world until 1926, when they were rearmed with 5 120 mm guns and 2 76 mm guns, their new main guns being surpassed by the 5 130 mm guns of the French destroyer Schickal, also commissioned in 1926. The next major innovation came with the Japanese Fubuki class or special type, designed in 1923 and delivered in 1928. The design was initially noted for its powerful armament of 6 5-inch, 127 mm, guns and 3 triple torpedo mounts. The second batch of the class gave the guns high-angle turrets for anti-aircraft warfare, and the 24-inch, 61 cm, oxygen-fueled Long Lance Type 93 torpedo. The later Hatsuhara class of 1931 further improved the torpedo armament by storing its reload torpedoes close at hand in the superstructure, allowing reloading within 15 minutes. Most other nations replied with similar larger ships. The Uss Porter class adopted twin 5-inch, 127 mm, guns, and the subsequent Mahan class and Gridley class, the latter of 1934, increased the number of torpedo tubes to 12 and 16 respectively. In the Mediterranean, the Italian Navy's building of very fast light cruisers of the Condottieri class prompted the French to produce exceptional destroyer designs. The French had long been keen on large destroyers, with their Schickal class of 1922 displacing over 2,000 tons and carrying 130 mm guns. A further 3 similar classes were produced around 1930. The Fantask class of 1935 carried 5 138 mm, 5.4 in, guns and 9 torpedo tubes, but could achieve speeds of 45 knots, 83 km per hour, 52 miles per hour, which remains the record speed for a steamship and for any destroyer. The Italians' own destroyers were almost as swift, most Italian designs of the 1930s being rated at over 38 knots, 70 km per hour, while carrying torpedoes and either 4 or 6 120 mm guns. Germany started to build destroyers again during the 1930s as part of Hitler's rearmament program. The Germans were also fond of large destroyers, but while the initial Type 1934 displaced over 3,000 tons, their armament was equal to smaller vessels. This changed from the Type 1936 onwards, which mounted heavy 150 mm, 5.9 in, guns. German destroyers also used innovative high-pressure steam machinery. While this should have helped their efficiency, it more often resulted in mechanical problems. Once German and Japanese rearmament became clear, the British and American navies consciously focused on building destroyers that were smaller but more numerous than those used by other nations. The British built a series of destroyers, the A-class to I-class, which were about 1,400 tons standard displacement, had 4.7-inch, 119 mm, guns and 8 torpedo tubes. The American Benson class of 1938 similar in size, but carried 5.5-inch, 127 mm, guns and 10 torpedo tubes. Realizing the need for heavier gun armament, the British built the Tribal class of 1936, sometimes called Aphrodite after one of two lead ships. These ships displaced 1,850 tons and were armed with 8 4.7-inch, 119 mm, guns and 4 twin turrets and 4 torpedo tubes. These were followed by the J-class and L-class destroyers, with 6 4.7-inch, 119 mm, guns and twin turrets and 8 torpedo tubes. Anti-submarine sensors included sonar, or ASTIC, although training in their use was indifferent. Anti-submarine weapons changed little, and ahead-throwing weapons, a need recognized in World War I, had made no progress. Later combat. During the 1920s and 1930s, destroyers were often deployed to areas of diplomatic tension or humanitarian disaster. British and American destroyers were common on the Chinese coast and rivers, even supplying landing parties to protect colonial interests. By World War II the threat had evolved once again. Submarines were more effective, and aircraft had become important weapons of naval warfare. Once again the early war fleet destroyers were ill-equipped for combating these new targets. They were fitted with new light anti-aircraft guns, radar, and forward-launched ASW weapons, in addition to their existing dual-purpose guns, depth charges, and torpedoes. In most cases torpedo and or dual-purpose gun armament was reduced to accommodate new anti-air and anti-submarine weapons. By this time the destroyers had become large, multi-purpose vessels, expensive targets in their own right. As a result, casualties on destroyers were among the highest. The need for large numbers of anti-submarine ships led to the introduction of smaller and cheaper specialized anti-submarine warships called corvettes and frigates by the Royal Navy and destroyer escorts by the USN. A similar program was belatedly started by the Japanese, Shimatsu-class destroyer. These ships had the size and displacement of the original torpedo boat destroyers that the contemporary destroyer had evolved from. Post-World War II. Some conventional destroyers were completed in the late 1940s and 1950s which built on wartime experience. These vessels were significantly larger than wartime ships and had fully automatic main guns, unit machinery, radar, sonar, and anti-submarine weapons such as the squid mortar. Examples include the British Daring class, U.S. Forrest Sherman class, and the Soviet Kotlan class destroyers. Some World War II vintage ships were modernized for anti-submarine warfare, and to extend their service lives, to avoid having to build expensive, brand-new ships. Examples include the U.S. Fram I program and the British Type 15 frigates converted from fleet destroyers. The advent of surface-to-air missiles and surface-to-surface missiles, such as the Exocet, in the early 1960s changed naval warfare. Guided missile destroyers, DDG in the U.S. Navy, were developed to carry these weapons and protect the fleet from air, submarine, and surface threats. Examples include the Soviet Koshin class, the British County class, and the U.S. Charles F. Adams class. 21st-century destroyers tend to display features such as large, slab sides without complicated corners and crevices to keep the radar cross-section small, vertical launch systems to carry a large number of missiles at high readiness to fire, and helicopter flight decks and hangars. Operators. Argentine Navy operates 4 Almirante Brown-class destroyers and a single modified Type 42 destroyer. Royal Australian Navy operates a single Hobart-class destroyer with 2 more to be commissioned. They are the first Australian warships to use the Aegis combat system and are based on Spain's Álvaro de Bazan-class destroyers. People's Liberation Army Navy operates the Liu Yang I, Liu Yang II and Luzhu classes. The latter two are armed with long-range air defense missiles, the indigenous HQ-9 and the Russian S-300 respectively. China also operates 13 Liu Yang III-class destroyers, 6 Luda-class destroyers, 2 Lohe-class destroyers, and 1 Lohe-class destroyer. The People's Liberation Army Navy operates the Souvremenny class, a class of large multi-purpose missile destroyers. They are powered by pressure-fired boilers, making them capable of speeds in excess of 30 knots, 56 km per hour. Their armament consists of 8 SSN-22 Sunburn anti-ship missiles, launchers for SAN-7 Gadfly anti-air missiles and 2 AK-130 twin-barreled 130 mm automatic naval guns which can fire laser-guided shells. While they also carry 533 mm torpedo tubes and RBU 6000 rocket launchers for use against submarines, their primary mission is to attack surface ships. Their anti-aircraft missiles have a surface attack mode, and both the 130 mm guns and the torpedoes are useful against ships at close range. Republic of China Navy, Taiwan, operates 4 Kidd-class destroyers, purchased from the United States. Egyptian Navy operates a single Frem multipurpose frigate purchased from France, with the hull classification FFG for guided missile frigate. Egypt also operates a single Z-class destroyer for training use. French Navy operates 2 Horizon-class frigates and operate new Frem multipurpose frigates. These stealthy ships are armed with anti-ship missiles and Aster surface-to-air missiles. The French Navy also operates 6 Georges Legs-class frigates and 2 Cassard-class frigates. The French Navy applies the term first-class frigate to Georges Legs, Cassard, Horizon, and Frem-class ships and uses the NATO hull classification symbol D6XX to place them in the destroyer type. German Navy operates 3 Sachsen-class frigates and 1 F-125-class frigate. These ships are classified by Germany as frigates, but are destroyers in terms of size and strength, and are usually labeled as such by other navies. Hellenic Navy the HS Velos, D-16, a Fletcher-class destroyer, remains ceremonially in commission due to her historical significance. Indian Navy operates 3 Kolkata-class destroyers. These ships are armed with BrahMos missiles, which have a range of 300 km, 190 miles, in the anti-ship role. Barrack 8 system is installed to counter airborne threats. Along with the Kolkata class, Indian Navy operates the Delhi and Rajput class destroyers. These destroyers also carry anti-submarine rockets and torpedoes. The destroyers have the capability to carry 2 Sea King helicopters. The Kolkata class will be augmented by the new P-15B class of destroyers, Visakhapatnam class destroyer, the construction of which was started in 2014. Islamic Republic of Iran Navy operates 2 Mudj-class frigates. These ships are internationally regarded as frigates or destroyer escorts, but are classified as destroyers by Iran. Marina Militaire operates 2 Horizon-class frigates and operate new Frem multipurpose frigates. These stealthy ships are armed with anti-ship missiles and Aster surface-to-air missiles. The Italian Navy also operates 2 Durand de la Penne class destroyers. Italy classifies the Frem with the NATO designation of F4 frigate. Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force operates the Atago class and Kong class destroyers which both employ the Aegis combat system. Japan also operates 2 Hitakaze class destroyers, 4 Akizuki class destroyers, 5 Takanami class destroyers, 9 Murasame class destroyers, 8 Asagiri class destroyers, 3 Hatsuyuki class destroyers, 6 Abukama class destroyers, and 3 Shimeoki-class destroyers for training use. Republic of Korea Navy operates several classes of destroyers including the Sejong the Great class, KDX-3, the Chungmyojong Yi Sun Shin class, KDX-2, and Gwangato the Great class, KDXI, of destroyers. The KDX-3 is equipped with the Aegis Combat System, Goalkeeper CIWS, Hyunmoo cruise missile and the Hasung anti-ship missile. Royal Moroccan Navy.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.